afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar on improving job readiness and retention for higher risk populations. My name is Erica Nelson, and I am a project manager on the Reentry and Employment Program at the Council of State Government's Justice Center. Before we begin, I have a few technical notes. If you encounter connection or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. This number is also posted to the chat box on your screen. Unfortunately, there are some connection issues we may not be able to resolve during the time of this webinar. However, we are recording today's webinar and will post on our website along with a copy of today's slides used in the presentation. Everyone who is registered for the webinar will receive an email as soon as the webinar is available on our website. You may also check the website directly for a copy of today's presentation at csgjusticecenter.org/NRRC. At the end of today's webinar, we'll have time for questions from the audience. To answer a question, please enter in the Q&A panel on the bottom right corner of your screen. You can ask questions at any point during the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer as many possible questions before we end today. Joining me today is Chris Warland, the Associate Director for Field Building at the Heartland Alliance's National Initiative on Poverty and Economic Opportunity, which includes the National Transitional Jobs Network and Ready Chicago. Chris supports employment services for chronically unemployed individuals across the country by providing consultation to employment initiatives at the local, state, and national levels, and overseeing the development of best practice guides, white papers, and other resources. Also joining me today is Amy Birch, the founder and director of the Turning Leaf Project, a national organization that provides reentry services in Charleston, South Carolina. Amy has 15 years of experience working in criminal justice and reentry arenas, including starting an alternative to prison program through the state and federal court system in South Carolina. This webinar is made possible through the National Reentry Resource Center, also known as the NRRC. The NRRC is funded by Second Chance Act and overseen by the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance. The Second Chance Act represents a federal investment of over $400 million to support state, local, and tribal governments and nonprofit organizations in their work to reduce recidivism and improve outcomes for people leaving incarceration. NRC staff, including myself, provide individualized, intensive, targeted technical assistance, training, and distance learning to support Second Chance Act grantees. Working with top researchers and practitioners, the NRC develops resources and tools to advance the knowledge base of reentry field and assist jurisdictions in implementing research-driven strategies to reduce recidivism. The NRC facilitates peer networks and information exchange through monthly webinars on key reentry topics, such as the one today, and national training events. The NRC also distributes a monthly electronic newsletter of news and reentry and research. Also, grantee success stories, funding opportunities, and training in the field. The NRC maintains the online, state, and local reentry directories that help people returning from incarceration and their families identify service providers in their communities. I encourage you to join the NRC distribution list to receive the latest information in the reentry field. Please subscribe at csgjusticecenter.org/subscribe. Here's the agenda for today's presentation. We will begin with an overview of the intersection of reentry and employment efforts, then share information on a newly developed checklist that assists providers in assessing the extent to which their employment programs are adapting best practices from the workforce development field that are shown to improve outcomes for hard-to-employ populations, including people who are formerly incarcerated or who are on parole or probation supervision. The checklist also assists providers in evaluating their program's use of service delivery principles from the reentry field that have shown to reduce recidivism. We will end today's presentation with a panel discussion on the integration of cognitive behavioral interventions and employment programs. Chris Worland will share information and lessons learned from the implementation of Ready Chicago, and Amy Birch will share her experience on this topic, including operating the Turning Leaf Project. So let's get started. The scope of the reentry challenge is too big to ignore. Federal, state, and local governments are managing large correctional populations. 1 in 38, or 6.7 million people, are under some form of correctional control. This includes states and federal prisons, local jails, and people on parole or probation supervision. Of those incarcerated in state prisons, 95% will be released. 2/3 will be rearrested within 3 years of release, and over 80% or 5 in 6 will be rearrested within 9 years of release. Although employment is an important factor for successful reentry, obtaining employment can be difficult for people with a criminal record or time spent in prison. An extensive body of research has been established that having a felony conviction or time in prison makes people significantly less employable. It's not that the persons who commit crimes are not interested in working, but rather that the felony conviction or time in prison can act independently to lower employment prospects. Without proper programming in prison, a person's employability skills can begin to decline. Also, being incarcerated minimizes a person's access to pro-social networks. Having a criminal record, especially a felony conviction, can create employer biases and legal barriers to employment, such as occupational license and restrictions. There are about 40 million adults in the U.S. with a criminal record. Based on a 2012 survey conducted by the Society for Human Resource Management, 87% of employers conduct criminal background checks on some or all applicants. Having a criminal record can reduce a person's likelihood for employment by 50%. The effects of a criminal record can be even more pronounced for people of color. To date, research on the direct impact of employment on recidivism is mixed. Few employment-oriented reentry programs have efficiently reduced recidivism, and even fewer have led to sustained employment. One of the key reasons for these poor results is that most programs focus solely on job attainment, when in reality, simply placing someone in a job is not likely to reduce recidivism or improve long-term job retention. What research has shown is that all the underlying needs related to committing crime must be addressed to reduce the likelihood for reoffending. Also, not everyone with a criminal record needs the same interventions. Certain interventions can be beneficial to some while causing an adverse reaction to others. Because of this, agencies should assess a person's level of job readiness and likelihood for recidivism and provide services based on those assessment results. This technique of matching, targeting, and tailoring services is a part of the Risk-needs-responsivity model, or R&R model. This model is perhaps the most influential model for assessment and treatment of people in the criminal justice system. The risk principle states that the intensity of services provided must match the person's risk to reoffend. The need principle states that assessing, then targeting criminogenic needs with the appropriate interventions. The responsivity principle states that in order to maximize a person's ability to learn from the intervention, the provider must tailor the intervention to the learning style, motivation, abilities, and strengths of the person. To reduce recidivism, agencies should target the 8 major risk-need factors associated with reoffending. The column on your left has the 8 major criminogenic risk factors, and on your right is the corresponding need. Criminogenic risk factors 1 through 4, the presence of antisocial behavior, antisocial personality pattern, antisocial cognition, antisocial associates, are the most predictive of future criminal activity. Interventions that address those factors will have the greatest impact on reducing the likelihood of future criminal activity. To promote job readiness, agencies should address the common barriers associated with people who are hard to employ. This includes family, logistical, and legal challenges such as issues with having reliable child care, having high conflict family situations, transportation problems, lack of stable housing, legal barriers to employment, and lack of proper documentation. Also, education and skill gaps such as low education level, lack of occupational and or soft job skills, gaps in work experience, etc., will need to be addressed. Needs related to responsiveness of intervention should also be addressed. This includes mental illness, substance addiction, lack of motivation, negative attitudes about work, etc. So why should workforce development professionals care about risk? The big 4 risk factors affect a person's ability to succeed in the labor market. Having negative attitudes on the job, unrealistic expectations about work, lack of self-control or self-regulation, and poor problem-solving or coping skills reduces the chances of a person securing and maintaining employment. So in order to see improvements in employment outcomes, agencies or providers will need to address the top 4 risk factors. So why should corrections and reentry professionals care about employability? When people have steady employment and earnings above minimum wage, they engage in more pro-social activities and fewer risky activities. They also generate income for their family, which creates strong positive relationships, improve mental health, and enhance self-esteem. Those things combined can reduce the likelihood of a person reoffending. There is a value in having an integrated approach to reentry and employment. When addressing a person's antisocial attitudes and behaviors, they will have a better attitude on the job, greater valuation of work, conflict resolution skills and problem-solving skills, which will lead to improved employment outcomes. By providing workforce development strategies, a person will have more structured time, pro-social associates, income stability, and the ability to support their families, which can reduce the likelihood of a person reoffending. Okay, I'd like to hear from you, the audience. I have a polling question. What is the most significant barrier to employment facing your client? A, limited work experience. B, legal barriers to employment. C, lack of occupational skills. D, lack of soft job skills. And E, negative attitudes about work. And I'll give folks just about a minute to put in one answer, and we'll share the results very shortly after. Okay, we'll close the polling at this time and begin tallying the results. And I did receive a question while we're waiting for the results to come in. There was a question in regards to what assessment tools are out there to assess risk. And there are quite a few. And I would share, we can share where the National Reentry Resource Center and the Council of State Governments have shared a listing of tools that could be utilized and the benefits and potential challenges with the use of the tool. So if you visit our CSG Justice Center website, you can gather that list, and later in the presentation I could actually maybe share the link in the Q&A session. Okay, so the results are in, and a large proportion of folks selected B, legal barriers to employment. So this is something that comes up quite often where a felony conviction could prevent someone from accessing employment. And there are a number of tools through the National Reentry Resource Center that speaks to this. And at the end of today's presentation, you'll actually see a link to our National Inventory of Collateral Consequences that speaks a little bit more about that. And there's also another resource called Clean Slate Clearinghouse that also speaks to identifying ways of mitigating those collateral consequences of conviction. Okay, so let's continue with the presentation. So while there have been advancements in the criminal justice system or the criminal justice field around strategies to reduce recidivism, and also in the workforce development field on how to improve someone's readiness for work, these advancements have been made largely on parallel tracks with limited coordination. And although they're often sharing the same population. In 2012, the Integrated Reentry and Employment Strategies, or IRES for short, white paper was published with the support of the Bureau of Justice Assistance and the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and with guidance from the U.S. Department of Labor. It brought together the best minds in corrections, reentry, and workforce development to discuss ways that recidivism reduction interventions can be delivered in the context of employment programming and how to triage limited resources by targeting services to those who need them the most. While the IRES white paper, within the IRES white paper, the diagram shown, which is called the Resource-Allocation and Service Matching Tool, is presented. The tool is heavily based on Risk-needs-responsivity, or R&R principles. It recommends the use of a validated risk and need assessment along with a job readiness screening or assessment to determine what types of correctional and employment interventions is most appropriate. Because the tool groups people first by risk, then by readiness for work, resources are most efficiently focused where they can be most effective. So in 2015, the National Reentry Resource Center began a 3-year pilot project of the framework in 2 sites, Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, and Palm Beach County, Florida. As a result, a few resources and tools were developed to assist jurisdictions nationwide identify ways to provide integrated reentry and employment strategies. One of those tools is the Self-Assessment for Employment-Focused Reentry Programs checklist. Administrators and direct service providers can actually utilize this checklist to assess the extent to which their programs are adopting best practices from the workforce development field that are shown to improve outcomes for hard-to-employ populations, including people returning from incarceration. The checklist can also be used to evaluate programs' use of service delivery principles from the corrections and reentry field that have been shown to reduce recidivism. Program administrators and providers can use the checklist to identify their program, whether their program provides services that promote job readiness for a person who's less ready for employment. Next slide. Such as education, vocational training, soft skills development, transitional job placement, and supportive services. Next slide. Program administrators and practitioners are also able to identify their program, whether their program provides services that support finding a job and retaining that job for people who are more ready for employment. Examples of these services are non-traditional subsidized employment, ongoing job coaching and job searching guidance, job development strategies, participant in employer-facing retention and advancement services, and financial work incentives. When utilizing the checklist, there are 3 corresponding statements that reflects intensity of employment program components offered. Each statement earns a certain number of points. Based on the number of points earned, users can determine whether their program is best equipped for a person who's less ready for work or more ready for work. For example, retention and advancement services that are employment-facing. These services are to mediate workplace issues, facilitate opportunities for advancement, and provide on-site support. The user of this self-assessment, the administrator or provider, if they do not provide these retention advancement services, they will select A, or the first box in the row. If the user provides retention advancement services, but they're mostly reactive, meaning that the employer has to seek out these services, then the user will select B, or the second box in the row. If the user of the checklist provides retention advancement services that are proactive and include strong employer program staff relationships and coordination to identify growth opportunities, the user of the checklist will select C, or the third box in the row. There are 5 service delivery principles that can be applied to employment programs to reduce a person's likelihood of recidivating. 1, engagement. This is providing positive, high-impact staff participate interactions to address antisocial thinking and behavior. 2, timing. This is offering services shortly before or immediately after release to address a person's immediate needs, including needs related to stabilization and adapting to services to a person's changing needs over time. 3, incentives. This includes stipends and maintaining employment for peer support recognition for program completion in order to increase motivation for positive change and improve job performance. Coordination with various agencies and service providers to ensure that interventions are provided in a way that support recidivism reduction and employment goals. And 5, structured time and effective programming and positive activities to minimize opportunities for criminal actions in time with antisocial peers. So in the checklist, it's the same as what I described before. Administrators and providers can identify their service delivery capacity, and they can identify whether or not their program is best suited for a person who is lower, moderate, or higher risk to reoffending. So you'll select the appropriate corresponding statement that accurately depicts where your program falls. So once the assessment is completed, program administrators or practitioners will have a better understanding of their program's capacity to provide effective practices for reducing recidivism and improving work outcomes. The next step should include aligning employment services with effective practice, developing different service tracks based on levels of job readiness and risk to reoffend, and developing formal partnership with other agencies that can provide services that are not offered due to various capacity limitations. Okay, so let's get into the discussion. But before we do, I want to maybe address or state what are cognitive behavioral interventions. We've been talking about them for a little bit of time now. But these interventions are designed for correctional populations. They target a person's thoughts, choices, and attitudes associated with criminal behavior. They help individuals recognize the antisocial behaviors, develop new strategies for coping with problems, also resisting antisocial peer pressure, and being mindful of perspectives and emotions of others. Cognitive behavioral interventions and treatments reflect principles of social learning that suggest individuals can effectively acquire attitudes, behaviors, or knowledge through observations and interactions with peers and others around them. Thus, cognitive behavioral interventions can be delivered with classroom settings, treatment settings, or case management sessions where providers use intensive feedback and instruction coupled with role play and rehearsal. Interventions such as motivational interviewing can be applied during case management meetings. Whether cognitive behavioral interventions are administered pre- or post-release settings as a standalone program woven into broader program design or used as regular interactions with correctional populations, they are strong tools for professionals to use in reducing recidivism. Studies show that these interventions can aid in job seekers experiencing a reduction in anxiety and depression. Also, job seekers can secure work more quickly. So I shared a lot of information about the history and the intersection of reentry and employment, as well as ways that agencies can identify whether their programs are aligning with best practices or what research has shown to work in terms of reducing recidivism and improving employment outcomes. I'm really excited to have with me today Chris Worland with Heartland Alliance and Amy Birch with Turning Leaf Project to share their experience with the use of CBI and strategies for integrating the intervention with employment program models. Before we get into the discussion, I'll ask that Chris, do you mind sharing a little bit about Ready Chicago? And Amy, following Chris, if you could share a little bit about the Turning Leaf Project.
All right, great.
So Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Erica. Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Worland. I'm with Heartland Alliance, based out of Chicago, Illinois. And one of the many programs that Heartland Alliance operates is called Ready Chicago. READY stands for Rapid Employment and Development Initiative, and the core components of Ready Chicago are intensive outreach to individuals who are at very high risk of engaging in violence, a transitional work or transitional jobs experience that allows individuals to earn income and gain some work skills and experiences, and a cognitive behavioral intervention to help individuals who are participating to change some of the behaviors that might put them at risk of engaging in or being victims of violence. So Ready Chicago is primarily a violence reduction program, and it is highly selective in the individuals that it serves. We only serve those Chicagoans who are at very high risk of being perpetrators or victims of gun violence. So our participants are not generally seeking services. They're not looking for us. We go out into communities and we look for them. We are partnering with the University of Chicago Urban Labs, who are both operating a randomized control trial to determine the effectiveness of Ready Chicago, and also doing the risk assessment activities to determine who are the individuals who are at highest risk of violence. In addition to partnering with the University of Chicago Urban Labs, we also have community partner organizations that are embedded in 3 communities in Chicago that are experiencing some of the highest rates of community violence. Those include outreach organizations who are doing the work of relentlessly engaging those individuals in communities, offering them the opportunity to work and informing them about the program and getting them to engage and say yes and come to work with us. We also have transitional jobs provider partners in those communities that are providing the actual subsidized work experience, as well as delivering the cognitive behavioral intervention, connecting individuals to other support services, providing some work readiness preparation and training, as well as other services for those individuals. Some of the innovative features of Ready Chicago, in addition to this combination of transitional jobs and cognitive behavioral interventions, are the length of engagement. So our outreach workers have up to 6 months to engage the individuals that we're trying to reach. Our transitional jobs opportunity lasts up to 18 months of subsidized employment, followed by an additional 6 months of supportive services, retention services, and ongoing cognitive behavioral interventions. We are, as I mentioned, in the midst of a randomized control trial. We have enrolled over 500 Chicagoans at this point into Ready Chicago, and we are committed to evidence-based practice to reduce gun violence and homicides in Chicago.
Thank you, Chris, for sharing information, and I'm going to really be looking forward to digging in and learning a little bit more about Ready Chicago in our discussion. So I'll turn it over to Amy to share a little bit about the Turning Leaf Project in Charleston, South Carolina.
Thanks, Erica. So my name is Amy Barch, and I'm the founder and director of the Turning Leaf Project. We are a community-based reentry organization located in Charleston. Our target population is men at ages 25 to 50, scoring medium to high on a risk assessment, recently released from incarceration. And we are a recidivism reduction program. We operate all of our services from a single site, 6,000 square foot location. The majority of our participants, we call them students, enroll voluntarily, primarily motivated by wanting better employment opportunities. Our students are at our reentry center every day, Monday through Friday, from 9 to 5 p.m. for an average of about 4 to 6 months. They spend 3 hours of the morning in cognitive behavioral training classes, and then they take a lunch break and then clock back in as W-2 employees, and they work in our on-site T-shirt screen printing business for 4 hours each afternoon. They also meet with our case manager a few times throughout the week for individual support. So students who complete all their classroom requirements, case management, and in-house work requirements are placed into a permanent job with a private company or public government agency. So the information that we collect during the assessment and intake process drives our treatment delivery decisions for each of our students. And we integrate cognitive behavioral interventions throughout the program. So our students learn skills in the classroom, and those skills are also reinforced in the hallways by staff and by our print shop manager and our work center. So our case manager creates a case plan for each student with specific targets aimed at that individual's major risk need factors, which Erica talked about a little bit earlier. And these targets become the focus of treatment in our classroom, in our one-on-one sessions, and also on our work center.
Thanks, Amy. And thank you, Chris, again, for sharing a bit about your projects and your agencies. Let's get the discussion started. As a National Reentry Resource Center technical assistance provider, I often receive questions about selecting a cognitive behavioral intervention curriculum. There are quite a few things an agency or provider must consider when selecting curricula: staff training, cultural competency of material used, the service delivery model, and how to keep participants engaged. Chris, can you share a few things that folks should consider when it comes to training staff to deliver cognitive behavioral interventions?
Sure, yeah. So, you know, when we selected our curriculum for Ready Chicago, we wanted to make sure that it was a curriculum that could be easily delivered by a wide range of program staff, many of whom in Ready Chicago have lived experience of justice involvement in violence, and you know, we thought it was really critical to engage and employ professionals, you know, in Ready Chicago who have that lived experience. And we wanted to have a curriculum that could be, you know, in which they could be trained and, you know, deliver that curriculum effectively and with fidelity. And so training for our cognitive behavioral intervention has been really critical. And we've really, you know, not only focused on training, but also ongoing observation, assessment, and coaching of those facilitators, you know, for continuous improvement in their fidelity, in their competency, in their skill level, and in their comfort in delivering the curriculum. And that's really been critical to our success. It didn't happen right away, and it certainly didn't happen overnight. But you know, over the course of our implementation so far, we've been able to see real and significant improvements in the fidelity and quality of the cognitive behavioral intervention that our participants are receiving. So that's been really, really important. In addition to, the facilitators in our program are known as coaches. So in addition to training our coaches and supporting our coaches in delivering high-quality cognitive behavioral interventions, we've also focused on making sure that the other staff members that are working with those participants also have a working understanding of the principles of the cognitive behavioral intervention so that they can reinforce and model some of those decision-making tools throughout the course of the workday. And so some of our crew chiefs and crew leaders who are, you know, supervising the work crews within the Transitional Jobs Program have also been trained in our cognitive behavioral curriculum, as well as some of our outreach workers, because, you know, our outreach workers are really the first point of contact with our participants. They're the ones who are developing that initial relationship, and they stay engaged with our participants throughout their experience with Ready Chicago. And so it's really important for them to be trained and to understand the principles of the cognitive behavioral intervention as well. And so in some cases, those have been, you know, workers that have been participating formally in the trainings, and in other cases, you know, they're learning about the principles of those skilled cognitive behavioral skills in a less formal kind of train-the-trainer experience with their colleagues. But overall, we have found that training is really critical, as well as, you know, just providing ongoing coaching and support. And that means regular structured observations of the cognitive behavioral sessions, coaching for those facilitators, and creating improvement plans for each of them so that fidelity and quality improve over time.
Thank you, Chris. And I really appreciate you talking a bit about, you know, training staff who are not necessarily facilitators. This was a practice in my years of corrections that we've very much encouraged, so that, like you said, every interaction with the client could be an opportunity to change a behavior or the person's thoughts about a particular issue or matter. So I, again, appreciate for you sharing that. Definitely a best practice there. Amy, is there anything you would like to add about training staff in CBI?
Yeah, thanks, Erica. So a couple of things. One is to just echo what you and Chris just said, which is that we've also trained all of our staff in what's called core correctional practices in order to enhance the effectiveness of the skills that we're teaching in the classroom. So some of these skills are like pro-social modeling and how to effectively reinforce pro-social behavior, as well as really just how to identify and disapprove of pro-criminal and antisocial behavior and how to use authority effectively. And then the other point I wanted to touch on, which is the last bullet, we, in regards to facilitation skills training, we started running community-based cognitive behavioral groups about 5 years ago. And research directs organizations like Turning Leaf providing cognitive behavioral services to enroll the right people in group classes, to choose evidence-based curriculum, to train facilitators in the delivery of that curriculum, and make sure that it's delivered as it was designed. And of course, all these factors are important to running effective groups. But one of our biggest lessons learned over the last 5 years has been that effective classroom behavior management and facilitation skills of the person running the group is as or more important than which evidence-based cognitive behavioral curriculum that an organization chooses to deliver. So we found that maintaining fidelity to the curriculum was irrelevant when our classes were filled with fighting and complaining, side-talking, sleeping, bathroom breaks, phone checking, and like all of the forms of disruptive behavior that really was contributing to low-quality programming for us. So typically, organizations look to manualize and scripted evidence-based curricula to fill their needs, and then the focus of the training is on understanding the content and how to deliver the scripted materials. But training on content doesn't equip people running CBI classes with the actual classroom behavior management and facilitation skills. They need to manage groups of high-risk people in a way that fosters a therapeutic relationship and maximizes learning and the practice of new skills. And this is especially important for organizations facilitating groups in the community, because cognitive behavioral classes aimed at reducing recidivism are intentionally filled with people of attitude and behavioral issues, so we should just expect that groups are going to be difficult. So besides training and the actual evidence-based cognitive behavioral content being delivered, it's really important to train facilitators in strategies to engage participants effectively and to respond to problematic behavior and enforce classroom rules so that the goals of the class can actually be accomplished. So a well-trained facilitator will know how to identify and respond to resistance. They'll know how to respond to disruptive behavior. They'll know how to use effective communication strategies like reflective listening and redirection, something called rolling with resistance, and positive reinforcement to keep students interested and engaged. So I thought I'd share some common mistakes that we see facilitators make. We see people outwardly argue or disagree with a student's point of view. Don't get enough buy-in from the group before asking them to practice a new skill, or they make too many suggestions and tell the students what they should work on. And these mistakes all increase the chances of having classroom behavioral issues. So at Turning Leaf, we facilitate both manualized scripted and non-manualized and non-scripted cognitive behavioral groups. And manualized scripted materials can be great and really effective, but I think it's important to understand that a person needs to have strong classroom management and facilitation skills to run an effective group, even with an evidence-based manualized scripted curricula.
Thank you, Amy, for sharing that and bringing attention to the point of the need of facilitation and communication skills. I often see in practice where you give people the content and say, this is what you need to deliver, but again, that important piece of like the delivery effectiveness, like how you deliver the curriculum in a way that supports, people learning these new skills is really important too. So thank you for highlighting the use of facilitation skills and communication skills to deliver the content. So, Chris, when it comes to the actual material used, the curricula, how does cultural competency fit in?
So I think there are a number of ways in which, this notion of cultural competency has informed both our curriculum selection, how we're delivering the cognitive behavioral intervention, and also, some other aspects of our service delivery. I think the first point worth mentioning is that, in Ready Chicago, we're really striving to be a trauma-informed intervention and to recognize how the experience of trauma is impacting the behavior and experience of our participants. So as I mentioned, Ready Chicago is really laser-focused on individuals who are at absolute highest risk of engaging in or being victims of gun violence. And as a result of that, very specific population focus, virtually 100% of our participants have had multiple repeated traumatic experiences. And so, everything that we do with regard to how we deliver services is viewed through that lens of how those traumatic experiences are impacting our participants' behavior, how they're impacting their perception of us as, service providers, and also how they interact with the cognitive behavioral intervention, how they interact with the work experience, et cetera. And so we know that, individuals who have experienced trauma, quite often, the behavior that they're exhibiting might appear to be disinterest. They might appear to be overly sensitive. They might appear to be, disengaged or to not want to be there. But we know that in many cases, rather than taking those behaviors and attitudes at face value, we have to look at, the traumatic experiences that they've had and how the way they're reacting might be a response to that trauma. And so, that influences our program in a number of ways, including how we deliver the cognitive behavioral intervention. Both in the selection of the curriculum and in the delivery of the curriculum, we really wanted for it to be non-judgmental, meaning, rather than telling an individual how to behave, we wanted, materials that just offered choices, helped individuals kind of look at the pros and cons and likely consequences of different behaviors, and then to make a choice based on their long-term goals and the outcomes that they want to see. And this applies both toward, the behavior that might result in violence and also positive workplace behavior. So really looking at, what are the likely outcomes for the different ways that I can respond to this situation, and which one of those outcomes aligns with what I really want. In addition to that, we really wanted, both the curriculum and the way it's facilitated to, not really make any unnecessary assumptions about our participants. Not all of our participants are just as involved. Many of them are, but some of them are not, and so we don't want to make assumptions about that. We're not working in a correctional setting. We're working in community. And so we wanted to avoid using language like offender because, that's not really how we want to, kind of like frame the identity of our participants who are living in community. We wanted to change some language. So, for example, we don't necessarily talk about illegal behavior or criminal behavior, but rather talk about risky behavior. So there are some ways in which we kind of want to modify or, monitor our own use of language. And we really finally wanted the curriculum material to be relatable to our participants. We wanted a curriculum that offered some flexibility to draw out scenarios and situations from the lives of our participants to use as examples for how to apply the tools and skills that we're providing them through the cognitive behavioral intervention. So those are some of the drivers of our decision making, as well as how we're implementing the CBI right
Thank you, Chris. And I just want to mention, I know there's a flood of questions who are coming in. Some of them I know will be addressed later in the presentation, but I wanted to maybe pause right here and maybe ask Chris another question that is not necessarily related to the material, but there is a question about how is Ready Chicago paid transitional jobs funded? Could you share with folks how this program is funded?
Sure. So, in 2016, Chicago experienced a spike in gun violence. And rates of violence that had been declining steadily over years suddenly increased. And as a result of that, a number of private philanthropic funders in Chicago really wanted to create a coordinated response to this increase in gun violence. And they engaged the University of Chicago Urban Labs and Crime Lab to determine what would be a good evidence-based response for that spike in violence. And the Urban Labs determined, based on their review of the evidence, that a combination of transitional employment and cognitive behavioral interventions would be the best response. And as a result of that, engaged Heartland Alliance to help administer that initiative. But what that's leading up to is just, kind of a rather unique situation in which we have a very intensive, large-scale, innovative intervention that is funded through private philanthropic dollars. Currently as a research project and as a proof of concept. And of course, we really hope that as we're able to show impact and to demonstrate that we can use these combinations of evidence-based models to reduce violence in Chicago, that it will be seen as worthy of public investments, and that we can support the ongoing programming in Chicago and elsewhere with public dollars. But currently it is largely privately funded. We also do, if you're interested in how transitional jobs programs in general are funded, we have some resources available through our website that talk about specific public sector funding strategies for transitional jobs programming.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And as I mentioned earlier, we do have a slide that has some resources on there, and it will include the National Transitional Jobs Network, which I think includes the information on funding resources. But if not, we can also maybe send a link in the chat box before the close of today's presentation. So I want to maybe turn it over to Amy and ask about service delivery. We know service delivery is key to implementation of CBI. Amy, what should partners think about when delivering CBI or developing their service delivery model?
Yeah, we found that one of the most important parts of having an effective service delivery model when integrating community-based CBI and employment-focused reentry services is to have a well-designed behavior management system. So you can think about this like a system that moves people forward and backward through the program based on their behavior. So an effective system will help participants manage their own behavior based on like a set of rewards and consequences. And for us, the best rewards and consequences that we found are objective, they're transparent, they're meaningful to your participants, and they're enforced consistently. And these rewards and consequences both signal to a person what's acceptable behavior, but it also keeps people engaged and motivated. And I think we're going to talk about that a little later. So Turning Leaf's behavior management system, it's been an evolution over the last 5 years. We now have a system for the classroom as well as for the process of moving somebody from enrollment all the way to job placement. So I thought I would give you a few examples today on the webinar for context. So I'll start out with an example of our classroom behavior management system. So we facilitate open enrollment cognitive behavioral groups where new students can start any day of the week. And we found it was difficult to decide, like objectively, who should advance or not advance in a fair and consistent way. So we figured out that our students performed better when the goal for advancement was clear, they knew exactly how to get it, and that it was attainable within a reasonable time frame. So we decided to create a point system for our classes. Our students can earn 5 points for each class, 1 for being on time, 1 for doing their homework, 1 for being in their uniform, 1 for staying awake, and 1 for staying off their phone. And we record these points for each class in real time, and we display them in the classroom on a whiteboard where everybody can see it. And these points equal out to a cash stipend that we pay our students for class participation. So we also have a behavior management system that moves people from enrollment to job placement, like I mentioned earlier. So students participate in a minimum of 150 hours of cognitive behavioral skills training over 10 weeks. And we found it was difficult to keep the same level of motivation up for the entire 10 weeks when there was no advancement. We realized 10 weeks was just too long to not move people forward. So we decided to break the 10 weeks into 3 levels. So our students, they must earn a certain number of points each week to move through the levels, and that moves them closer to job placement. But on the other side, if a student earns under a certain number of points, then they move backwards. So this point system also mirrors a similar point system in our work center. And the weekly points for the classroom and the work center are displayed for each student on a dry erase board in our program hallway. And that way each student knows exactly where they are in the program, and they're given daily and weekly feedback on their behavior and how it's moving them closer or further away from job placement, since that's the ultimate goal for most of them for enrolling in turning leave. So having an effective behavior management system has probably been one of the major parts of our success over the last few years. So Erica is going to talk a little bit about dosage in the next couple slides, but I thought I would just talk about a little bit about what we've seen at turning leave. And really what we've noticed is that quality of interventions has a huge impact on the quantity that's needed. When we created a highly effective behavior management system, both for the classroom and for the larger program, and we trained staff in facilitation and classroom behavior management skills in addition to the curriculum content, our quality of programming went way up. With 10 weeks of daily, intensive, and high-quality CBI, we see behavior changes with our students, even those scoring at the highest risk to reoffend. So it's just important to remember that conversations about dosage, that is how much, how often, and over what time frame, it shouldn't overshadow the importance of ensuring that those interventions are delivered at a high quality. And the last thing I'll talk about here on the slide is our case management program. Because we have an all-day program in a single site location, we're able to engage our students in multiple one-on-one case management sessions each week. The main purpose of case management is to address the individual's risk-need factors identified in their case plan and respond to any behavioral issues they may be having in the program. And then we also use this time to address stabilization issues like housing or medical needs, as well as determine fit for job placement. It would be very difficult for us to integrate cognitive behavioral interventions and employment effectively without regular one-on-one time with our students to address individual level needs. So our case manager uses a variety of research-driven cognitive behavioral tools that we've tailored specifically to use in one-on-one settings to improve thinking, decision-making, and problem-solving skills. So we call this our cognitive behavioral toolkit. And we use this toolkit in case management and in our non-manualized, non-scripted cognitive behavioral groups, which we run as an aftercare sessions when students complete the initial 10 weeks of classes. This toolkit gives us essentially unlimited CBI material to continue to work with our students on their risk-need factors without relying on scripted materials.
Thanks, Amy. Service delivery model is so important in terms of having effectiveness in the actual content and things that are necessary to improve behavioral change. Next slide. So to reduce the recidivism rate of higher risk populations, programming and services should include cognitive behavioral, human services, and additional skills building interventions. These interventions should target the 8 major risk need factors previously described. There is limited research on dosage and recidivism to date. However, studies show that higher risk populations could need upwards of 300 hours of dosage over 9 to 18 months to have a significant impact on recidivism. Examples of interventions are described in this chart. In addition to providing interventions that addresses a person's assessed needs, providers must take into consideration the sequencing of interventions to support stabilization of a person, just like what Amy just mentioned. In column A, there are cognitive behavioral correctional interventions. These interventions can be utilized to address the top 4 criminogenic factors. So you'll see examples of curriculum, brand curriculums here that have been utilized to address those factors. In column B, there are cognitive behavioral and other human services interventions. These interventions address the other criminogenic needs that don't necessarily fit into the top 4, and they may be provided in addition to interventions in column A. Depending on the severity of a person's needs, these services may need to be provided before or concurrently with column A to support stabilization. In column C, there are additional skills-built-in interventions that also address criminogenic factors, including education and employment. So as we're developing more and more information around dosage, what we're finding is that these areas described in this chart can count towards dosage, that they don't necessarily all have to come from one brand curriculum, but that there's a number of different needs that have to be addressed, and they can be done in a variety of different ways as shown in this chart. In addition to providing cognitive behavioral, human services, and additional skills-building interventions described previously, next slide, people will need other supportive services that are not directed towards changing criminogenic risk, but support stabilization. This includes non-skill related interventions such as assistance with obtaining identification, transportation services, housing, financial literacy, etc. So I want to ask Amy and Chris, in terms of engaging participants in cognitive behavioral interventions while in a community, what is it that folks should be thinking about? I can understand that when providing these services in a community, it can be a challenging task, as many people have competing priorities, right? They have to secure employment in order to earn income for families, as well as their personal needs. They have to meet with their supervision agent or officer. They also have to meet demands and expectations of their family or courts. Amy, can you share strategies Turning Leaf uses to keep people engaged in CBI?
Sure. So Turning Leaf is a voluntary program. So, and we work with, folks that are higher risk to reoffend. So we definitely use a lot of different strategies to encourage people to first enroll and then keep people engaged once they are enrolled. So our ability to place men with long and serious criminal past and competitive employment is probably our #1 engagement strategy. Most of our students are referred by friends or family members who went through the program and are now working in permanent jobs with benefits. So at Turning Leaf, we don't use job placement as an intervention to address the major risk-need factors related to criminal behavior. Instead, we use it as an incentive to participate in the cognitive behavioral intervention classes, as well as to help maintain positive changes over time. So definitely job placement is one of our big strategies. We hire all of our students to work in our print shop, and we use in-house employment both as an engagement and a retention strategy. We've been running our print shop full-time for about 2 years, and we've seen a major increase in retention rates since we became our students' employer, in addition to a program provider. We also use a variety of other incentives to increase engagement. We pay a cash stipend for participation in our daily cognitive behavioral groups. I think I mentioned that earlier. I explained the point system of our groups. The daily points translate into the amount of the stipend that we pay our students. And as a person moves to the program levels, the points become worth more money. We give out stickers to reinforce certain behaviors like being on time or handling a setback well. So we're always around our center looking for opportunities to give stickers out. And then the guides can use the stickers to purchase things like snacks or gift cards or T-shirts in our little store. We also give out tickets, like raffle tickets, to students for being on time or moving up in levels and phases. And then we have a weekly drawing for a $5 gift card. And then also, it's really important for organizations to really think through program design and optimize it to keep participants engaged. And I talked about this a little earlier also with our behavior management system. We find that our students are more motivated when they have opportunities to make quick advances. So the longest phase in Turning Leaf with no advancement that we have is 6 weeks. And it only takes our students 2 weeks from their first day of enrollment to go up a level if they earn all their points. So it's also helpful to design a program where people move forwards and backwards based on behavior rather than everybody sort of being at the same like flat level. So we found it more effective to look at progress based on behavior rather than like hours of treatment or time in the program. Because when a person doesn't advance because they're like consistently late or maybe they have a positive drug test, they all of a sudden start getting a lot more motivated to change their behavior when they start seeing other students moving past them and onto job placement. And then the last thing I'll say on this slide is that we use our staff relationships as an engagement strategy. It's really important for me that all of our staff have high quality relationships with our students. And we characterize high quality relationships as respectful, caring, enthusiastic, and collaborative. Opportunities for employment we see get people in the door, but the relationships we build with our students is one of the reasons that they stay enrolled. So last year, I hired my first staff who has lived experience of incarceration. So my other staff don't have a criminal record, but they're still highly effective at working with the high-risk population in their respective roles. That is in case management, in the classroom, and in our work center. But I really noticed that having a person on staff who is relatable to my students from a lived experience perspective has made a big difference for us in terms of student engagement, retention, and graduation rates.
Thank you, Amy, for sharing that information. There is a question that has come up. They asked how many people are in the Turning Leaf program. How many people do you serve per year?
We've enrolled about 50 guys last year, and for us, enrollment means they've been in our classes for 2 weeks or more. So we lose most of our students within the first day or two of enrollment. So they'll come, they'll sit in classes, we'll get them started in the print shop, and then they'll drop out right away. So we've had a lot more than 50 that have done that, but we've had 50 people that stuck. In the next 12 months, we anticipate on about 65. And then it might also be helpful for context. Yeah, we have 6 staff. So I have one person in each of the roles. So I have one person in our print shop. We have one person in the classroom, one case manager. We have one person doing job development, and we have one person doing outreach.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy, for sharing that. Chris, can you share strategies that Ready Chicago utilized to keep people employed?
Hi, yeah. So, our incentive structures are pretty similar to Turning Leaf's. I think that, it's important to note sort of the role of transitional jobs within the Ready Chicago theory of change. We know that transitional jobs programs on their own are an evidence-based strategy for reducing recidivism among individuals who are returning home from incarceration. But in the case of Ready Chicago, we really use the work opportunity principally as an engagement tool so that participants will come and participate in our cognitive behavioral interventions and other services that we have to offer. And I often, joke and say that, if we were to, to go out into our communities and, knock on doors of individuals who are at very high risk of engaging in violence and inform them about an opportunity to receive free cognitive behavioral therapy, we might not get the same level of engagement that we get by, showing up and offering them a job. And so we really use that offer of a job as an engagement tool, particularly since, as I've noted, none of our participants are really seeking services. They're not coming to us They're not interested in engaging in any kind of programming typically when we first show up and engage them. And so to be able to say we have a job for you and that you can start working within a couple of days of showing up is a really powerful engagement tool for us. And so the first work opportunity that each of our participants has is a very low barrier to entry job where they're working on work crews. They're doing what we call neighborhood revitalization. So we're working, in the community, cleaning up sidewalks, cleaning up vacant lots, doing other kinds of similar tasks. So everybody starts in a work crew, and everybody starts at what we call stage one. Although, there are a number of opportunities to advance within the transitional jobs experience for our participants. We have a number of criteria that we use to determine when somebody is ready to advance, including attendance, improvements in rates of attendance, participation in our CBI, the number of hours of CBI that they receive, how their supervisors rate their performance and level of effort and safety on the work site. And so as our participants meet some of these criteria, they have the opportunity to transition from the work crew to a variety of different subsidized employment experiences that we have lined up. So we work with a number of private sector employers, primarily in construction and manufacturing. We also have opportunities for our participants to work in some public sector work opportunities as they advance, such as the Parks Department and Animal Care and Control in Chicago. And then finally, they have opportunities to advance into sector and occupational skills training as well. So, and part of that is because we have 18 months of transitional work available, and we want them to have a sense of advancement and momentum and progress within that TJ experience, because we really want to actually maintain engagement with them for a duration of time that allows them to get an adequate dosage of the cognitive behavioral curriculum. So whereas a lot of transitional jobs programs might be interested in transitioning people to unsubsidized work as quickly as possible, we really understand that we're competing with the competitive labor market to keep these guys engaged. And at times of low unemployment, it's often easy for participants to find work elsewhere, once they've begun working with us. But, we want to maintain that engagement to keep delivering the cognitive behavioral intervention in order to affect behavior change and decision-making related to violence. Also, like Turning Leaf, we do offer stipends and other incentives for participating in the cognitive behavioral portion of the schedule during the day. So our participants are paid a wage during their work hours, and they receive a gift card stipend for participating, in the cognitive behavioral intervention time during the mornings. But I think that really, kind of one of our strongest lessons learned so far is that if you want to engage individuals who would not be engaged otherwise, that the promise of paid work and the ability to deliver rapidly on that promise of paid work is a great way to engage people who you might not have a chance of working with otherwise.
Thank you, Chris. And that's a perfect segue into the next question about, the integration of subsidized and unsubsidized job placement with employment services. Can you share a little bit about how Ready Chicago does this integration of CBI with transitional jobs?
Yeah, so, as I mentioned, we really see these two evidence-based models as working well together, and our hope is that when we're able to measure our impact, we'll see that the result of combining these two strategies is kind of more than the sum of its parts. And we do have some evidence to draw on to support our combination of these two models. There have been a few other smaller studies that have been conducted that focused specifically on providing both a cognitive behavioral intervention along with paid work or income that have resulted in reductions in violence specifically. And so we do have, some evidence base supporting this. And, as I mentioned, we have found that, the transitional jobs model, if it's structured in such a way as to provide rapid attachment to a low barrier job, that it can be a really great way to get individuals engaged, not just in CBI, but in other types of services and interventions that we might want to provide them. So that transitional work, it provides stabilization. It allows, for engagement in other services and activities, because if somebody doesn't have enough income to meet their basic needs, they're not really stable enough to engage in other kinds of services. And so there's that, that critical stabilizing feature. And we recognize that we're able to offer something of real value, that a job is something that people recognize they need. And later on in that process, we find our participants see a lot of value in the cognitive behavioral work, but they don't necessarily see the value immediately. The immediate value is seen in the employment. But we have a lot of anecdotal, stories of participants who might get suspended from their transitional job, and the first thing they ask is, can I still come in and participate in the cognitive behavioral group work, because they've discovered that it holds real value for them. I'll also say that we've designed Ready Chicago with the understanding that that progress is not going to be linear. That our participants, because of the inherent risk and trauma in their lives, might drop out, they might disappear, they might get upset and quit, they might get suspended or fired from their transitional job. And we want to have the opportunity to re-engage them, to re-employ them. And that's part of why we have such a long engagement period of 18 months in transitional jobs. So if somebody, for whatever reason, drops out, if they get suspended or quit, if they go to jail for a while, our outreach workers are prepared to go back into the community, locate them again, re-engage them, and say, we have a pathway for you to come back. And so, we really want to just recognize that, people need opportunities to fail, to mess up, and to try again. And so, Ready Chicago is structured in such a way to kind of recognize that reality and offer opportunities to come back. And then, finally, even though Ready Chicago is primarily a violence reduction initiative, and we're going to be evaluated and judged based on whether or not we can lower the rates of gun violence, we also recognize that we have an obligation to connect people to unsubsidized employment once they're finished with their work experience. And so we're also, really focused on building out opportunities for real economic opportunity beyond the transitional jobs period through employer engagement, work readiness preparation, et cetera, because we want there to be, real hope for economic progress at the end of our engagement.
Thank you, Chris. Everything you said was spot on with what we hear from, grantees as well as the larger field around the need for the consistent re-engagement, right? So we talk about second chances, but a lot of times with the higher risk population, they may need third chances or fourth chances. So it's very encouraging to hear that there is opportunity for that at Ready Chicago. So I'll ask Amy the same question, if she could share a little bit, and I know we want to leave about 10 minutes for questions or about 5 to 7 minutes for questions, but can you share a little bit of information on how Turning Leaf Project integrates CBI into in-house employment and unsubsidized job placement services?
Sure. So we integrate cognitive behavioral interventions with in-house employment through our on-site T-shirt screen printing business. So we use our work center as an engagement strategy, just like we do job placement, but we also use it as an intervention to address the risk-need factors related to reoffending. So these are some of the things that were mentioned earlier, Erica, on one of your slides, like negative attitudes on the job, unrealistic expectations about work, lack of self-control, et cetera. So work at Turning Leaf becomes a place to practice the skills we're teaching in the classroom. And then full circle, students bring in work situations to use as role play scenarios to practice skills in the classroom. And our case manager uses our CBI toolkit to address any work-related situations that have been challenging in the print shop. So we're easily able to practice skills like stop and think and problem solving when our students make requests to impulsively leave work for emergencies. And we're also able to help them develop other work-related skills like making a complaint, responding to authority, and using assertive communication. So our students are hired immediately to work part-time in the afternoons for 10 weeks after they get done with their classes, and then they come on full-time for around 6 weeks before they become eligible for job placement. So for us, for our guys to be placed into a community job, our guys have to be passing drug tests. They have to be showing up to work on time every day. They have to have a good attitude and good work ethic. So we basically just have to see them using the skills they're learning in the classroom when they're in the center. And our in-house work model, I've noticed since we started the print shop a couple of years ago, it's given us so much more credibility and traction in our search for job placement opportunities. Employers are just a lot more willing to give somebody with a criminal record, especially the kinds of records our guys have, a shot when they know we've hired them first and we've seen their work. And it also gives us a lot more confidence in saying that a person is work ready. So until last year, we were just placing our guys in 2 government agencies at the city and the county. But I hired a job developer this year to help us start placing guys into private companies. And so now we're placing in a combination of different public agencies and private companies. So I know somebody chatted with me a little bit ago asking about job placements and what those kind of look like for our guys. So it's really important for us to have the right type of job placements that are going to support the students' lifestyle changes. For one, we want to make sure we're placing men into permanent jobs that have livable wages and opportunities for growth and benefits. And as I mentioned earlier, these types of jobs are an engagement strategy to get the guys to enroll and also to help our guys stay committed to their new lifestyle over time. So we look for jobs specifically that are stable and consistent because our students operate best in highly structured environments. So we look for jobs where the coworkers, they're going to be working with the same people, the times of the shift are always the same, they always show up at the same location. And for people that do job development, probably know this can be really tricky because our guys oftentimes have never worked before and they don't have a lot of transferable skills. And the types of jobs available to our students, at least here in Charleston, are mainly temp work and restaurant work. And this is often the exact type of work that's the least compatible with supporting a crime-free lifestyle. So we're really particular about the types of jobs we place our guys into. It has to be a good fit. So our case manager and job developer spend time matching people up. We're looking at abilities and interests, transportation, culture of the company, and management style. And so all this can be pretty logistically challenging. Sometimes the guy's ready to go out on the job, but we don't have a job lined up. And sometimes we have a job lined up, but the person isn't ready yet. So we basically use our print shop to be able to continue to engage people and keep them employed while we find a good match. And then sometimes people want to know how we find our jobs. We do a lot of community outreach through like our Chamber of Commerce, our Rotary clubs, and we also just network a lot through our supporters and donors. We invite businesses into our center. We have a lot of visitors that come and sit in our classes so they can see the work that we're doing with the guys before job placement. We have employers come and tour our print shop so they can see the guys at work. We market ourselves as providing 150 hours of soft skills training to prepare people for the workforce. And sometimes we'll reach out to try to do print shop sales to try to get some t-shirt orders, and the company will end up wanting to hire our students. So they kind of support each other like that as well. We also help some of our students get their commercial driver's license. We partner with other community agencies to pay for training, and we use a local truck driving school to provide the training. So we will actually pay our students a stipend while they're in training program full-time to help with living expenses. And then finally, we ask our students to make a 90-day commitment to any job we place them at, and then we ask them that when they're ready to leave, that to give a 2-week notice. We support our graduates with longer-term employment needs. So we continue to provide one-on-one case management after job placement. We check in with all of the job placements regularly. We advocate for our students within the companies that we're placed at. And even post-graduation, we help our students access training resources and just additional employment opportunities even after their initial placement.
Thank you, Amy, for sharing that information. I want to now open it up for Q&A, and we had quite a few questions that came in, some of which have been addressed through the presentation and the discussion, but maybe I'll ask the first question, which is in relation to engagement techniques that were successful with getting employers to participate in the Ready Chicago program. So Chris, this question is for you. What kind of techniques did you utilize to get employers engaged in Ready Chicago program?
Yeah, so, of course we're working with individuals who are at very high risk of engaging in violence. And we really had to be transparent and honest with employers that this is our service population. This is who we're working with. This is the reality of what you're getting into if you want to partner with us. Just to make sure that we were really honest about, who we're serving and what employer partners could expect. And we were really surprised by the overwhelming positive responses that we heard from most of the employers that we engaged. Typically, we would go in kind of bracing for a difficult, challenging conversation with an employer, and what we would hear from them is, yes, I want to be part of the solution, I want to partner with you. And this is true of both public sector and private sector employer partners. We just found that, because Chicago was in the midst of a gun violence crisis, that all of the employers that we spoke with were really motivated to be part of the solution. Many of them have stuck with us through, many difficulties. But in this case, a really big part of it was that employers wanted to support a Chicago with safer communities, and they were motivated by that.
Thank you, Chris. Another question came in about the paid work experience for transitional jobs. There was a question about whether, depending on the type of transitional job, is there variation in the wage? And then there's another question about what is the average wage after completing the program. I'm guessing, once they're connected to unsubsidized employment.
I can speak to the first question, which is that in Ready Chicago, we pay the minimum wage in Chicago, which I believe recently went up from $12 to $12.50, and will ultimately, top out at $15 an hour, I think, if I'm getting those numbers right. And so we want to make sure that we're paying, at least the minimum wage. We also want to offer our participants a chance to get, incremental increases in their transitional jobs wage as they move from one stage to the next. So we have like small, maybe like quarter raises per hour as participants advance. But as far as data on post-TJ wages, we don't have that yet because not very many of our participants have reached that 18-month mark yet.
Thank you, Chris. This question is for Amy. Have you had any trouble finding print shop clients to work for you? If it is well known that your employees are returning citizens. I think this is a two-part question. So the first question is, have you ever found any trouble with getting folks to work in a print shop?
Have I ever had any problems so my students I have one print shop manager, and he supervises anywhere from 10 to 15 of my students who are in the print shop every day working. And then we are reaching out to local businesses to find orders to support their wages and offset costs. I'm not sure if I answered the question.
I think that's a good response. And I'll take one final question, and I'll ask our host to maybe go to the slide with the resources so folks can be able to see those resources that we have that I mentioned earlier that folks can access. A question, this could be for Chris or Amy. What is your relationship with courts and the probation office? Have you had any calls or check-ins, you know, or any issues with coordinating with probation?
I mean, I can definitely answer this. Our building is right around the corner from probation. Almost all of our students are on parole or probation. We do still have some people that are in there that have pending charges. So we do work with the courts. Turning leave is sometimes used as a condition of bond in federal court, where people will be released out on bond. They'll have to complete turning leave. And if they complete it and stay out of trouble for a number of years and complete their supervision, they will have their charges dismissed. So we do work closely, especially with federal probation, but we work closely with state probation as well.
And at Ready Chicago, we do have a recently implemented up and running referral stream directly from both the Illinois Department of Corrections and the Cook County Department of Corrections. And so whereas up until this point, you know, virtually all of our participants were coming from communities in Chicago, we now have referral streams up and running where individuals who are being released from incarceration, whether it's the county jail or the state prison system, who are returning home to one of our identified communities, can be referred directly into Ready Chicago through that referral stream.
So awesome. So thank you, Chris and Amy, for sharing that information. I want to say we're at time. It's now 3:31. So I want to, you know, close out the webinar by saying thank you to everyone who participated in today's webinar on improving job readiness and retention for higher risk populations. I want to say thank you to Chris Worland and Amy Birch for sharing their in-depth expertise on this topic area with the field and those who are extremely interested based on the questions and inquiries we hear and get from the National Reentry Resource Center. Everyone should receive an email with a link to the survey asking for your feedback on today's webinar. Please take a moment to fill out the questionnaire or the survey. It's really helpful for us to improve the resources we provide to the field. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, this presentation is recorded, and a recording of this presentation as well as the PowerPoint slides used will be posted on the National Reentry Resource Center webinar site in the next week or so. In the meantime, please feel free to reach out to us directly with any questions, concerns, or requests for additional resources. And please do not forget to sign up for the National Reentry Resource Center newsletter. Thanks again for your participation and have a great day.